Hello guys, warmest welcomes to the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, and I hope that as you join me, you're all hanging in there. If you are or have been suffering, then my thoughts are with you, and I hope that you're on the mend. And if as you hear this that you're stuck in lockdown like pretty much the majority of everybody else, or you're self-isolating for a week, 2 weeks, even 12 weeks, bloody hell, then I hope that the cabin fever hasn't set in for you just yet. It's time to get binging those box sets right now, or podcasts of course, and that's where I come in to hopefully help. So you join me here for Patreon bonus episode number 27, and of course I'm as ever Paul, the creator, host and true crime enthusiast of the show's title, whereas you guys are the very kind, very appreciated supporters, both returning and new ones, of the True Crime Enthusiast podcast. Now before we crack on with this month's bonus episode, I do have some extra special thanks to all of you this month. I appreciate the understanding from you of myself sharing some of these subscriber bonus episodes on the regular show for everybody, because busy times such as now call for a use of the back catalogue that I've got, and others maybe just to help out as a little bit of a pastime through these self-isolating lockdowns. It's a proper unprecedented time for us all right now, isn't it? But we've got to do what we can to help out wherever and however, because every one of us is a tiny little cog. Sharing stuff to hopefully entertain is something small that I could do, so I chose a few episodes to share. And you guys did as well on a poll, and your response has been out of the park. It's been excellent, guys, so thank you very much. You're the best supporters ever. So in these strange and busy times, I'm trying my best to do business as usual. And business as usual is of course a monthly bonus Patreon episode of the show. For any new show supporters for who this is your bonus episode cherry poppin', then these bonus tales are usually not as long as a regular show episode, but nor are they as empty of content as Kanye West's head is. I do research them for as much fact and detail as I can find, and each tale always works out as long as it needs to be. There are also no live reads for products, no adverts or promos for any other shows. We just launch right into the case that I've chosen for the episode. Bonus episode number 27 features a chilling tale that I came across while I was researching a different case from the previous series. It wasn't one I'd ever heard of before, and when I read up on it further, it almost chose itself for a Patreon episode of the show, so I earmarked it for a later date. Until right now, where it comes to you folks. For the episode, we head back to the mid-1980s and to a city we visited several times before on the show, the city of Birmingham in the West Midlands. The tale looks at how one man's very specific, unhealthy obsession built up over time, until he was to eventually make his greatest fantasy come true, resulting in the macabre, horrific death of a young woman. Now if that doesn't sound bad enough, a visual reminder of this death may still be out there somewhere to this very day. The episode contains descriptions of a crime and events that some listeners may find disturbing or distressing, so please use your discretion as always whilst you're listening in, guys. Bearing that in mind, please join the True Crime Enthusiast as we look back at a case I've entitled Enough Rope. In these days where you can pretty much watch anything online, I'm sure there are still several oddballs out there who'll still go to any lengths to see the deepest, darkest fantasies on film. Today it's probably been replaced by the dark web, as there's a massive underground market in things such as this. But going right back to the start of the 1980s, the decade where our tale takes place, it was under-the-counter video nasties. People have always loved watching simulated murders on film. It's why the horror and thriller genres are still as successful and popular as they are today. I'm sure we've all seen them. I grew up watching all sorts of horror movies long after there'd been a bit of a cull, and stuff like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Evil Dead and The Burning were all banned for several years, considered to be video nasties for the horror that they depicted on screen. Now I got to see these and more like these in a similar way. I used to spend a lot of time with some older cousins of mine who were into stuff like this, and the local video van man, if you're from the UK, maybe you remember them, He used to come around who had copies of all sorts of films like this. Don't ask where he gets them from. And if you asked him, you could get to see him yourself. Misspent youth, what can I say? So although I saw loads like this as a youngster, I always knew that they were just films. But occasionally, there will of course be someone who goes just that bit too far, and a filmmaker decides to dispense with all simulation or special effects and creates a snuff movie. Now, if you've never heard that term before and you're not sure what I'm on about here, well, basically it's a film in which a person is actually murdered or commits suicide for real or is genuinely sexually abused on screen. These films may or may not be for financial gain for the filmmaker, but it is a film that supposedly, I quote, circulated amongst a jaded few for the purpose of entertainment. If you can't find anything on Netflix, of course. Now, thankfully, it's a rare occurrence that films such as these come to light. It's not something you want to imagine, really, is it? But they still do exist, and especially with production technology as it is today, there must still be plenty of weirdos about who will seek out a copy of films like this and pay a decent price for it. However hard to come by it is, I'm sure they find ways around it. The advert placed in the newsagent's window read, "Regal gowns, film and fashion require young lady for part-time modelling. Experience not necessary. Apply Mr. G. Jones, 16 Eggington Road, Hall Green. Tel 744-9006. Hall Green is a district in the southeast area of the city of Birmingham in the UK area of the West Midlands. Home to less than 30,000 people, famous names to have hailed from or lived here include comedians Joe Lycett, or Hugo Boss I believe he's changed his name to now, Tony Hancock, whose catchphrase "up the bracket" is my favourite wiki stat that I found here. It was used by fan Pete Doherty to name the Libertines' debut album, and a fabulous album it is too still. And J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote a couple of books telling tales of fictional bare-feet humans and mystical jewellery. Totally not my thing at all. Who wants a walk that lasts 3 books? Come on. Hall Green was also home for many years to Geoffrey Graham Jones, an unemployed, unmarried loner who, following the death of his mother, lived alone at number 16 Eggington Road, a massive film buff who had placed the aforementioned advert in the newsagent's window. Not just someone who sat in watching old movies all day long, Jones had for several years had a keen and active interest in filmmaking itself, and he'd progressed this by becoming a member of a local filmmaking society, through which he wrote scripts and made a series of short films, proper having the bug and hoping that he could do this as a full-time career. And whilst it's true that Jones was capable, and he did indeed make a series of short films, there was no way that he was ever going to be the next Steven Spielberg, because the scope of his imagination was limited. Well, it was very limited actually, because through all of the scripts or film ideas that he came up with, 3 things were always constant. The focus of the film would always be a young woman. She would always wear a black satin figure-hugging dress, black shoes and seamed stockings, and in each she would be put in some form of immediate physical danger, either underneath the wheels of a train or a bus, or by a hangman's noose. Over a number of years from the early 1980s, Jones had advertised successfully for models to take part in films he had thought up involving themes such as this, and had previously filmed several girls dressed up in mock peril as described, operating under the name of Kit Arden Motion Picture Productions. By April 1985, the former insurance salesman, dress hire proprietor and cinema projectionist was still advertising for models, and his card in the newsagent's window caught the eye of a 16-year-old girl named Marion Terry, who couldn't believe her luck. Unemployed and desperate for work, Marion was immediately attracted by the advert as the location was less than a mile away from her home in Hall Green's Coal Valley Road, and making a note of the number, called Geoffrey Jones when she got home and arranged to go around to Eggington Road for an audition later that afternoon. Just before she put the phone down to Jones, he told her, "Wear something black." Marion, excited at the prospect of a possible career she'd never considered, put the phone down jubilantly and raced to tell her parents. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, she'd made the short journey around to Eggington Road, dressed in his smartest outfit, complete with black pencil skirt and heels. But a modelling career wasn't to be on the cards for Marion. Nothing was. The next time she was seen, at 8:50 p.m. the same evening, was by police officers and paramedics summoned to number 16 Eggington Road. The householder, Jeffrey Jones, was by that time in hospital, and Marion was still in his house, hanging by her neck from a rope attached to a beam of wood in the loft opening. The rope was professionally tied in a hangman's noose, complete with a quick release end that was tied to the stair banister, but this had not been pulled. The tips of Marion Terry's feet were left just slightly touching the ground, and there was a piano stool behind her. She was dead, killed by Jeffrey Jones. Just over a year later, on Monday the 21st of April 1986, the 4-day trial that opened at Birmingham Crown Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Sir Joseph Cantley, told a jury of 8 men and 4 women the entire bizarre story that had culminated in Marion's death. As they listened to the gruesome and chilling details of the case, more than one jury member was visibly shocked to hear how Marion had met a horrendous end at the hands of a man who prosecuting counsel Brian Escott Cox QC described as a monster in human form. Sat in the dock in a brown suit with open-necked shirt, 48-year-old Jeffrey Jones listened as in his opening speech, Mr. Cox described how Marion Terry, an unemployed school leaver who had lived with her parents in Coal Valley Road in Hall Green, had just over a year previously, on the afternoon of 18th of April 1985, been out searching for jobs when a card affixed to a newsagent's window caught her eye. She was especially drawn to the advert on the card, which stated in bold black lettering, "Regal Gowns Film and Fashion require young lady for part-time modelling. Experience not necessary. Apply Mr. G. Jones, 16 Eggington Road, Hall Green, telephone 744-9006. When Marion, excited at the prospect of paid modelling, rang Jones, he told her to come round to his house for an audition wearing something black, which Marion had complied with. Reading aloud an extract from a statement given by Marion's father, Stanley Terry, Mr. Cox said, "Marion phoned up immediately and Jones told her that he would give her an interview. He asked if she could wear a black skirt and said that another applicant had not been suitable because she had turned up in jeans. I would have taken her around there in our car, but I had to wait in for the gas fitter, so I agreed she could go alone. She never aspired to be a model and would have preferred to be a hairdressing apprentice, but she was fed up and wanted work." Jones, Mr. Cox continued, had written a short film script entitled Enough Rope, a macabre and bleak tale about a young woman unhappily married to an older man who had eventually hanged herself without realising she'd just had a win on the pools. He'd explained the premise of the script to Marion upon her arrival and took her up to the loft of his house, which he'd converted into a makeshift studio of sorts, fitting it out with a video camera, a recorder and assorted props and sets, which is a bit of an exaggeration really, as these props consisted solely of assorted ropes and the set consisted of nothing more than a noose suspended from a hook fixed into the ceiling, underneath which was a piano stool. Jones told Marion to stand on the chair and to place the noose, professional looking hangman's noose which appeared to be made from an ordinary length of clothesline rope and which was produced as an exhibit to the court, around her neck. Freaked out, Marion had balked at this and refused, causing a struggle to ensue between her and Jones, in which she tore at his shirt, bit and punched him. But Jones had managed to force the noose over her head, and had then pulled the stool from underneath her feet, leaving her to hang and choke to death, whilst his recording camera captured every detail of the last moments of Marion Terry's life. Mr. Cox told the court, "Jones killed her in a fashion so strange and so bizarre that if you saw it represented in a work of fiction or drama, you would discredit the author. Mercifully, she died very quickly. At any time, Jones could have cut her down or released her by using the safety knot, but he did none of these, because it was Jones's greatest fantasy come true, to hang a woman." You don't even want to imagine something so foul, do you? Poor, poor girl. About 90 minutes after Marion had arrived, at 4:30 p.m, Jones was seen by a neighbour of his driving away from his home, having first placed a package of some sort in his car. It was believed that in all likelihood, this package was the film that he'd just taken of Marion's murder, which Jones was going to dispose of either by posting it to someone or leaving it in the custody of a trusted associate for safekeeping. Mr. Cox told the jury, "You may be asking yourselves how he was able to contact young girls and enjoy these sexual fantasies. The answer is that he's an amateur filmmaker and he advertised for models. Some young girls get carried away by the idea of becoming a model or a film star. It certainly worked in Jones's case." On the second day of the trial, evidence was given that Jones had claimed to police he had attempted to resuscitate Marion after returning upstairs to find that she had accidentally hanged herself during the filming of the mock hanging scene. Detective Chief Inspector Barry McKay of Birmingham CID described an interview he'd conducted with Jones following his arrest, telling the court, "Jones told me that Marion was posing, standing on a chair with a noose around her neck, which she'd slipped over her head herself. She then asked Jones to go and fetch her handbag, which she'd left in the bathroom downstairs, as she wanted to comb her hair before he filmed the shot. He did so, and when he returned to the attic, he found that the chair had slipped and the girl was hanging. He claimed that when he tried to undo the knot in the noose, she bit his fingers and kicked him, bombarded him." Now, this interview with Jones had taken place following his release from Solihull General Hospital, where he'd been taken on the day of Marion's death following an alleged suicide bid. He claimed to have swallowed 100 aspirin in an attempted overdose, though this was ultimately found to be a massive over-exaggeration, but after his stomach was pumped and his life saved, he'd been released from hospital and taken into police custody. Jones himself next entered the witness box to give evidence. He described to the court how in preparation for the film he was making, he'd advertised for a model on a card placed in a local newsagent's shop window. Marion Terry had responded to this advert, and after speaking to her on the telephone, a meeting was arranged for the same day, in which he'd promised to pay her £10 an hour as a modelling fee, plus an additional fee of £50 when the film he was making, Enough Rope, had been completed. He admitted to the court that he had not at first informed Marion that she was to be asked to take part in a hanging stunt for the film, but instead had only told her once she was already in his upstairs studio. Jones explained this off by saying, "After all, no girl in her right mind would go to the house of a chap she didn't know from Adam, stand on a chair and put her head in a noose." But later he claimed to have casually told her about the script, saying, "In the end, you have to hang yourself." When he said this, he claimed Marion's eyes lit up. When they'd reached the part of the short film where Marion's character had to hang herself, Jones continued, Marion helped him set up the staged noose, stood on the stool and placed the noose around her own neck by herself perfectly willingly, as if it was giving her a thrill, he claimed. It was at this point that she told him to stop to allow her to comb her hair first, before the shot was filmed, and asked him to go downstairs and fetch her handbag, which she'd left in his downstairs bathroom. According to Jones, it was at this point, while he was downstairs getting the handbag, that he'd heard a bump from above. He'd rushed back upstairs and found the girl hanging from the noose, desperately struggling with the stool on its side about 2 feet away from her. Jones expressed the opinion to the court that he was unable to tell whether the hanging had been an accident or whether the girl had deliberately kicked the chair away herself in order to experience what a real hanging would feel like, possibly in the belief that it may produce a thrill or a sexual release. He told the court, "The idiot had the noose around her neck. I saw she'd tried to experience hanging for the thrill of it, in my view." Jones then related how he'd tried to revive Marion when he'd found her hanging. She was still very much alive, he claimed, because when he grabbed her by the feet to lift her body to release the pressure on her airway, she had lashed out and kicked him hard in the chest. All hell let loose, he described. He'd abandoned this tack and then instead tried to loosen the knot, but upon doing so, Marion bit his fingers hard and began punching him, as though she had 4 sets of hands, he claimed. She then, before his very eyes, started making gurgling noises and eventually went limp, and it was at this point that he realised she was dead. He said that upon realising this, he went into the bathroom as he felt violently sick. When he returned, he claimed that in shock, he could not believe that the hanging had been for real and that his model had actually died. It was only at that point, he claimed, that it occurred to him that the camera was still filming, and he made a point of switching it off before sitting down on a stool, the very stool on which Marion had stood moments before, stunned whilst he tried to work out what best to do. He claimed in his police statement, "I did everything in my power to get that girl onto that chair." All this time, he said, his anxiety was exacerbated by Marion's body, which was suspended no more than 2 feet away from him. Jones claimed that shortly after Marion's death he lost consciousness, came to, and had then decided that the best course of action available to him would be to take his own life. He sat down and on a writing pad wrote a suicide note, which read, "Murderer, I killed this girl, the innocent girl. I murdered her in hatred. I can still smell the perfume on this young girl. Oh, her parents, her poor parents. Black satin ruled my life, for what turns you on will eventually control you. Jeffrey Graham Jones." According to Jones, he then swallowed 100 aspirin and went and lay on his bed clutching the Bible, praying and waiting for death. Accordingly, he decided then that it would be best to go and die at the house of his girlfriend Margaret Pugh, who was out at the time walking her dog, but who returned home only a very short time later to find him on her doorstep. Through sobs, he told Margaret he'd taken 100 aspirin because he deserved to die for his actions, claiming that a girl had died in his house earlier that day. He explained that she'd come around in response to an advertisement to do a film stunt, and that during the course of filming, he'd accidentally killed her. Quite a tale that, eh? Jones's girlfriend, 41-year-old Margaret Pugh, was the next witness into the box, and concerning Jones's behaviour at her house on the day of Marion's death, supported Jones's story, telling the court, "He was crying, he was very excited and mumbling that he'd taken 100 aspirin. He told me there's a girl dead in the house. He said the girl had come around to do a stunt for a film and he'd killed her. He kept saying he deserved to die for what had happened." She also told the court that although she classed herself as his girlfriend, they were not lovers in the accepted sense. Theirs was a relationship devoid of any physicality whatsoever, because Jones was impotent. She went on, "We've never had any sexual relationship because he told me he's not capable. He told me that he does not get any feelings of sexual excitement whatsoever." Now, bar Margaret Pugh, almost the entire court, and you guys by now I would imagine, considered this story to be an absolute shamble of bollocks. Margaret had then rung for an ambulance and spoke to Controller Michelle Green, who had logged the emergency call and was the next witness to give evidence to the court. Margaret had told her that Jones was, I quote, in a bad way in her house, having told her that he'd taken aspirin in a suicide attempt and that he would rather die in her home than in his own house, in which there was a dead body. Consider a boyfriend or what? She then relayed what Jones had told her. Michelle then spoke to Jones himself, and a tape recording of this call was played to the court, an extract from which is as follows. On the tape, Jones admitted he'd taken an overdose and added, "I have killed a young girl." Michelle replied, "That's nothing to do with you, that was an accident." Jones, "No, it was deliberate." Rushed to hospital, where he was found to have taken nowhere near what surely would have been a fatal dose of 100 aspirin, Jones was recorded as having said whilst there, "I'm sorry to give you all this bother. I went to my friend's house to die, but she sent for you. I've also killed a young girl. Her body is in my house." Jones was told that was a matter for police, not hospital authorities, but who subsequently called the police to attend and to take Jones's statement, which in essence was the same as that he'd told the court. Whilst he was making this statement, police officers went around and forced the door to number 16 Eggington Road, finding tragic Marion hanging from the noose upstairs. A search of the property revealed a number of evidential items that police seized, including the film script for Enough Rope, the bizarre rambling suicide note that had been written by Jones, and an equally bizarre and macabre poem, again penned by Jones, entitled 10 Little Beauty Queens, which we'll touch back upon a bit later on in the episode. But although the camera was still in place, there was no film of Marion's death discovered. The idea that Marion Terry could have been experimenting, possibly to see whether the sensation of hanging produced any feeling of sexual thrill, as Jones had suggested, was refuted outright by her former boyfriend Brian Wilcox, a 19-year-old college student. When asked if Jones's claim could have any substance, Brian told the court, "Marion was a clean, immaculately dressed and bubbly sort of character, easy to get on with. She was a normal girl and certainly had no bizarre fantasies. She didn't even approve of page 3 girls. We were planning to marry after I'd completed my studies and got a job. She was unemployed after leaving school, and I can quite understand that she would have jumped at the chance of earning money as a model, although I think she was foolish to go into the house of a man she did not know who advertised on cards. It wasn't as if it was a well-known film company advertising in the newspapers. Still, I didn't know she was going there, or I would have warned her of the risk involved that this was some sort of weirdo." Asked whether he considered Marion's death to have been an accident, Brian replied, "I don't think so. She would have been too careful to let such a thing happen." The third day of the trial was taken up with the evidence of witnesses who'd both known Jones previously and who had modelled in the past for his other films, and it was here that Jones's bizarre and chilling character was given more colour for the jury. First up to give evidence was a former workmate of Jones's, a pastor for a small Christian congregation in Solihull named David Gardner. David had met Jones in the late 1970s when both worked for Lucas Cookson Limited, an engineering design company in Cranmore Boulevard in Solihull. The two became friendly, enough for the loner Jones, who lived at the time with his widowed mother, to confide in David that he claimed to have a gun at home and how he hated certain sections of society who he termed as yobbos, but also had a distaste for Jews and other ethnic minorities, instead expressing admiration for the ideologies of Adolf Hitler as described in Mein Kampf, which Jones claimed to have read several times. A copy was indeed found at Jones's home following his arrest, along with a sizable library filled with books about the occult and black magic in which Jones had a vested interest, in case he doesn't sound appealing enough already. By early 1981, however, according to Gardner, Jones had dramatically changed these viewpoints, and in fact now showed a lot more sensitivity and acceptance, particularly towards the Jewish faith. He'd begun avidly reading the Bible by that time and was making a much more concerted effort to get to know people and to integrate himself more at work. He had by this time also developed himself a new hobby that he seemed really keen upon, amateur filmmaking, going so far as to join the Solihull Amateur Film Society. Now at the time, David considered this a healthy hobby and interest and encouraged Jones in this pursuit. But shortly afterwards, Jones's mother passed away in April 1981, leaving him alone in the house that they'd shared for many years and sending Jones into a deep depression which he required psychotherapy for. Following this, he'd accepted redundancy from Lucas Cookson and lost contact with David for a while, but around Christmas 1981, Jones contacted David again and began going around to his house regularly to spend an hour or so discussing the Bible. But the Bible wasn't all that Jones would discuss during these visits with David, because he now began to also openly share details about his sexual fantasies and his inability to physically consummate his relationship with his girlfriend Margaret Pugh, who Jones had actually first met some years before through a dating agency, but had ended the relationship with because his mother had disapproved of her. Jones confided in David that he actually had no interest in women in the naked form, but rather had an obsession with them wearing black satin ever since he'd seen his mother wearing it when he was a youngster. It was all that he thought about. He even went so far as to confide that his obsession meant that he couldn't ejaculate in a normal way, blaming this on him being a victim of black satin syndrome. Bit of a step up from rabbiting on and on about the Last Supper, that, isn't it? David Gardner now noticed that once Jones had confided in him about this problem that he had, he would mention it to him whenever they met. He would still go on about the Bible and his films and filmmaking, but the satin obsession had crossed over and begun to dominate even this, with Jones going so far as to claim that he'd even had a black satin dress specifically made for models in his films to wear, and even mentioned that he'd worn the dress himself on several occasions. Feeling uncomfortable hearing this, because you would do, wouldn't you? David Gardner told the court that he'd advised unsuccessfully to get Jones to adopt a healthier attitude to his sexual problems, advising him to talk to his group therapy meetings about it and suggesting to him that he destroy the item to try and rid himself of what was clearly becoming an unhealthy obsession. But it was to no avail, and after about a year of Jones going on and on about his weird coming and his satin fetish, David Gardner told him firmly not to mention it ever again to him, uncomfortable at clearly seeing the visible satisfaction that Jones was getting from even mentioning it. He was becoming visibly aroused just by mentioning black satin. Yeah, yuck. And after this admonishment, for a while he hadn't mentioned it again, and the talk went back to parables and psalms. But by 1983, it had crept back up and he was off again at it, recounting how whilst working as an insurance salesman some years before, he'd gotten to know a former policewoman who he'd persuaded to wear, guess what? A black satin dress, of course, and to pose at his home for a series of photographs. Now you're thinking, right? And it's boggling my mind as well, because although he already sounds a right one, to look at him, he'd be good looking if he lived in Royston Vasey. Have a look at his picture on the show's Instagram page when you're done hearing here. He looks like something bloody Jim Henson got fed up of making halfway through. Proper weird looking oddball, you know. But nevertheless, Jones had managed to persuade the woman, and bearing in mind this is an ex-policewoman, to pose for him in this get-up, complete with a noose around her neck. Jones told how she'd agreed to pose like this, so he'd gone up the stairs with his ready-made noose, tied the rope to the banister, and then got the woman to stand on a stool below with it around her neck. She complied willingly with all of this, and he began pulling on the rope, but the woman pulled her end and told him to stop, which he immediately did. Jones then told the shocked Gardner that as he did this, he was experiencing orgasm. He furthered that he'd put the noose around the woman's neck because he hated women and doing this released his hatred for them. As she'd been stood on that stool, Jones claimed he'd gotten an urge to kick the stool away from under her, but hadn't. He then proudly showed Gardner the photographs he'd taken proving this story true, before asking him if he would tell the police if he'd told him that he was going to hang a woman and that he couldn't stop himself. When Gardner said, of course, he'd tell him everything, because you just would, wouldn't you? Jones then said in response, almost incredulously, "What, tell on me? I'm your friend." Not the kind of oddball you want coming around to your house, really, that is it? And would you pose like that? All I can say is, whatever floats your boat. And the ex-policewoman was far from the only one to have posed like this for Jones. The court was to hear testimony from 2 out of several others. Many others may not even have come forward. 26-year-old Christina Atner, a model who'd been one of Jones's previous leading ladies, told the court how she'd starred in a short film he'd made some years previously entitled Safety Last. When it was completed, Jones had staged a premiere of it at his home, inviting Christina, her husband and her mother to attend. Upon their arrival, they were ushered into the darkened dining room of Jones's house, in which rows of chairs had been placed, accommodating some 20 people in all, mostly other members of his film club. Jones had even gone to the quite bizarre lengths of hiring a girl to act as an usherette, serving ice creams and lollies to his audience in his pop-up cinema. Now, the plot of the short film Christina was in sounds absolute bollocks. It just simply seemed to consist of her, clad in black stockings, black high heels and black satin dress, of course, narrowly escaping death in a number of ways, including dodging certain death under the wheels of a train, being apparently struck and run over by a bus, and finally being hanged. Do you see a bit of a pattern here, or what? At that time, Christina told the court, the modelling fee that Jones had offered was only £2 per hour. Her mother and her husband had both been aware that she was starring in this macabre movie and had voiced no objections when she told them she was going to be auditioned for the film in a private residence by a man who was advertising under the name of Kit Arden Motion Picture Productions on cards that he'd placed in shop windows. Christina then described to the court that upon her audition, Jones had taken several still colour photographs of Christina wearing an array of tight all-black outfits. Promotional stills, he'd claimed they were. She then recounted the various procedures that Jones had performed during the filming of Safety Last. Firstly, he'd filmed her wearing a selection of figure-hugging dresses, usually made of satin and always black, all over his home. He then took her in his car to a nearby railway siding, where he placed her between the buffers of 2 stationary engines and filmed her apparently being crushed between them. Jones had told her to assume expressions of pain and abject terror on her face, but not to scream for fear of attracting attention. He told Christina he would dub the screams in later when he was editing the film. For another scene in Safety Last, where Christina was struck by and went under the wheels of a bus, Jones took her to a depot where buses that were out of service or in need of repair stood and made her lie underneath the wheels of a stationary double-decker bus. She admitted to the court that this experience had frightened her, and it took some for her to steel her nerves to go through with posing for the shot. Again, once doing so, he'd asked her to simulate a look of terror, which probably she didn't need to try too hard to do, but again told her not to scream, not wanting to bring maintenance or facilities staff running to the scene to investigate. Finally, for the climax of the film, Christina had to simulate a self-hanging. She told the court, "He asked me to stand on a chair and put a noose around my neck. I was told to put my head on one side to make it look as though my neck had been broken. Then he got me to climb up the wall to reach a sort of ledge where I had to cling on with my fingers, leaving my legs dangling. He then filmed my feet as they dangled. It was a rather difficult scene to do as the ledge was rather high up on the wall. I had to redo it several times before he was happy he'd got it right." Throughout it, I got the distinct impression that he was enjoying all this very much, but I wasn't enjoying it at all. Mr. Cox asked her, "Did you realise it was a real sliding noose, and if you fell, your life would be in very great danger?" Christina replied, "I must admit I didn't think of it at the time. Perhaps if I'd not posed for it, Marion might be alive now." The court was also told that following the screening of Safety Last, at the end of the film, a short excerpt from the scene Jones had shot, showing Christina posing dead like this with a noose around her neck, had been used for a trailer for his next film, Enough Rope. Christina, however, was never to work with Jones again. She was too unnerved and uncomfortable to. The next person he got to pose for the macabre scene was Marion Terry. Another model who'd worked for Jones previously, 25-year-old Dawn Chambers, also told the court that some years before she'd starred in a similar short film made by Jones entitled 10 Little Beauty Queens, which illustrated his own version of the rhyme 10 Little Indians, but putting the macabre spin on it that in his version, 10 beautiful girls each met a horrific death as the rhyme went on. Jones had first seen Dawn's picture in a newspaper posing as a 19-year-old model in 1979 and had eventually managed to track her down and badgered her to appear in one of his films. She said, "He told me that all of his family had died of cancer and he wanted to make a film before he went the same way. Eventually, I felt that sorry for him I agreed. He had a black satin dress made for me and I had to wear black stockings with 4-inch heels." Dawn too had been paid £2 an hour for a modelling fee, but neither Dawn nor Christina had received any sort of bonus payment as had been promised once the film had completed. Instead, each just received free tickets to admit family members or friends to the premiere screening of the film, which was again shown at Jones's pop-up cinema in his house. Following Christina's refusal to appear in Enough Rope, Jones later approached Dawn to play the same part as tragic Marion Terry was to audition for, and although at first Dawn considered it, perhaps swayed by Jones's offer of £1,000 for the part, and even went through an audition, ultimately she found the mock hanging too much. She told the court, "My boyfriend held on to me in the chair in case I slipped. Jones wanted to tie the other end to the banisters, and it was all rather scary." It was indeed too much for her, and unnerved, Dawn sacked it off and told Jones to find himself another model. She went on, "He told me he was disgusted with me because the film was his life's ambition and it was for a big competition. I remember walking away feeling rather ashamed because I felt I'd let him down. Now I know what a lucky escape I'd had." Lucky indeed, eh? And competition, my arse. The majority of the fourth and final day of the trial was occupied by summing up. As for the prosecution, Mr. Cox gave his closing address to the jury. He totally dismissed Jones's given version of events, denouncing the story as preposterous and a tissue of lies. Unlike Jones's defence counsel, Anthony Smith QC, who had told the court, "Jeffrey Jones is a quiet, introverted, lonely man, but a monster is what is being offered to you," Mr. Cox instead described Jones to the jury as a sexually dysfunctional man with the most extreme of fetishes, telling them, "This is a man with very serious sexual problems and sexual perversions. Almost certainly he cannot perform the normal sexual act. He instead obtains sexual pleasure and relief from fantasies about young women and girls in danger of death. His greatest enjoyment is that of visualising young girls in skin-tight black clothing, terror-stricken, in a situation of life-threatening danger. You will have to try and get inside the warped mind of this man and try to understand his bizarre fantasies. Only then will you be able to see how he could have carried out such a dreadful deed." Mr. Cox then, somewhat dryly, stated that Jones had in the past been an ardent, keen and vocal supporter of the reintroduction of capital punishment by hanging, As he looked across at Jones, who could not meet his gaze in the witness box, he added, "No doubt his present predicament has watered down his views about that." He went on, "His principal delight is in hanging, and to hang a young girl was the ultimate fantasy, which he turned into reality on the 18th day of April, 1985. He lied to the police and to the hospital staff that it had been an accident. That is pure rubbish. He killed her in a struggle to force her to put the noose around her neck as she was stood on a chair. In that struggle, she bit his fingers, which was proven by doctors at the hospital who examined Jones, and by police photographs of his injured fingers once Jones was in custody, which were consistent with human bite marks. It is true that he took an overdose of aspirin, but this suicide bid was as fake as some of the scenes in his films. Doctors who treated him have stated that the amount of aspirin he actually took was minimal and would not have killed anybody. Jones sat quietly listening in the dock, not displaying any visible sign of emotion, as Mr. Cox continued. He had made several other films before the final one, during the making of which Miss Terry died. He wrote 6 sexual fantasies into the script for these productions, in which Miss Atner, Miss Chambers, and at least 2 other girls diced with death whilst enacting hanging scenes at Jones's home, until his ultimate fantasy came true with the hanging of Miss Terry in a real-life snuff movie. We have proved up to the hilt this man's sexual fantasies of black satin, danger and the noose. It's something that must have played a very large part in this girl's death, because otherwise, why did he tell a thumping lie to the police about it? There is no doubt that there was a struggle before that noose was tightened around that girl's neck. Did he then have the afternoon of a lifetime with a real-life body hanging in his house? It is open to question how many other young women have literally taken their lives in their hands at the mercy of this monster in human form. We shall never know, for no others have come forward, and Jones is not telling. It took the jury of 8 men and 4 women just 55 minutes to unanimously find Jeffrey Jones guilty of the murder of Marion Terry, and he showed no reaction at all as the judge, Sir Joseph Cantley, said that in his opinion the jury had reached the right verdict. Asked if he had anything to say upon hearing the verdict, and when Mr. Justice Cantley passed the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment upon him, Jones made no reply whatsoever, before being taken away to begin his life sentence. Now, Jones had for several years been receiving psychiatric treatment for deep depression brought on following the death of his mother some years before, but the question of his sanity had never been raised during trial proceedings. He was examined on remand and deemed fit to plead, and was ultimately found by a jury to be bad but not mad. Now, the main talking point upon cessation of the trial: what had happened to the real-life snuff movie he'd made of Marion's death. Police were certain that Jones had deliberately filmed Marion Terry's death up there in his makeshift studio, once he'd kicked the chair away from underneath her feet. As a filmmaker obsessed with death, specifically young women meeting all manner of gruesome ends, but always coming back to hanging, you bet a month's wages that to someone as warped as Jeffrey Jones, it would be the greatest thing he'd ever captured on film, and no way would he have missed filming it. But no such film of Marion's death was found during the search of number 16 Eggington Road, so police contended that he could have either posted the film to an accomplice, possibly another member of a CD network into the same thing, who traded in disgusting obscene films such as was described earlier, or he could have driven it to the home of an associate and entrusted it to them for safekeeping. A third option was that Jones could have hidden it in a safe place known only to himself, although they considered this much less likely, as there was the risk of damage to the film resulting in its loss, or it falling into the wrong hands. Like you get much wronger than Jeffrey Jones. He certainly went off somewhere in his car with a package in the hours following Marion's murder. He was seen leaving his house by a neighbour, and it was a good couple of hours after this that he arrived at his girlfriend's house with his bollocks story about his 100 aspirin suicide bid. Where had he been in the interim? Following the trial, Detective Chief Inspector Barry McKay was quoted as saying, "It was all pretty childish, but it was all part of his fascination for women in slinky black dresses, black seamed stockings, pencil skirts and pillbox veiled hats. We shall never know exactly what Jones did whilst that poor girl was strung up for all those hours. It is absolute rubbish for him to say he tried to revive her. No attempt whatsoever was made to cut her down. Mr. Cox produced the noose in court, and anyone could see that it had not been cut at all. Marion Terry hung there for 5 hours. I'm convinced that during that time he took photographs and filmed that poor girl. He'd waited all of his life to hang a woman. I cannot believe he would let the moment slip by. I'm convinced that Jones continued to film her as she was hanging there. Afterwards, I think he went to conceal the film, the intention being to retrieve it after his eventual release. All of Jones's mail was intercepted following his arrest and was scrutinised for months after his conviction even, but no clue was ever to emerge as to the whereabouts of the supposed snuff movie, and Jones was never to reveal what had happened to the film. Refusing point blank to discuss it, it was a secret that he kept with him amongst his warped and peculiar bents and thoughts. Even in his outgoing letters following his incarceration, he still harped on about these fantasies involving women clad entirely in black satin, although predictably, he made no mention at all of his hanging fantasies. Margaret Pugh, soon after Jones's conviction, understandably wrote to him in prison telling him that things weren't working out between them and they needed some time apart. In other words, fuck off, you evil weirdo, which is understandable enough, isn't it? He did write back to her, apparently agreeing to this, but signing himself off as Supermaster, whatever the hell that means like. Christina Atner, his first muse for Enough Rope, also wrote to Jones whilst he was in prison, telling him that she was giving up her aspirations of being a model. The one close shave that she'd had with him was enough to have put her off for good. That girl could have been me, she told him in her letter. Jones replied to her, in part, it might have been, but it wasn't. Still, in a way it's all been a bit of a giggle, but I knew that in the end I would have to pay the price for all of the good times. You hearing this? All of the good times? Yes, he had no remorse whatsoever for his actions, not one bit. He didn't even seem arsed to be in prison, completely resigned to his fate. He was even quoted as early as in his second police interview following the discovery of Marion's body at his home as saying, I can see the funny side of it. Whatever the outcome, I'm going to write a damn good story about it. You couldn't make shit like this up, could you? Now, whilst I was researching the episode, I was unable to discover whether Jeffrey Jones remains today, almost 34 years on, as a serving prisoner, whether he's been recategorised or even released. It's not known as to whether he's even still alive today. If he is still alive, he will today be 83 years old. And undoubtedly, throughout all of the prison time that he served, he'd never once stopped thinking about his black satin or women dying in a series of ever gruesome ways, because it was what floated his boat after all. For someone who confided in a friend that he hated women, Jones seemed obsessed enough with them. Found in a search of his house after his arrest were a series of diaries, which were all depressingly bleak and void of anything interesting in the most. But a constant theme throughout each was a scoring system that Jones kept of different women that he'd seen on screen or glamour models in the newspapers. As an avid film buff, he would spend hours watching old movies from the silver screen, rating the likes of film stars such as Marilyn Monroe or Doris Day or the lovely Raquel. I couldn't say that in Morgan Freeman's voice if I'd tried. If he found a female star of the film attractive, he would mark in block capital letters in his diary, wow, double wow if he thought they were really something else, and for the likes of page 3 glamour girls, they got a wow double wow, his highest rating ever. But the diary entries, which although they're uncouth and childish and more than a little would suggest that Jones, in some form at least, appreciated women. It was a complete juxtaposition with the poem found at his home that I did say earlier we would touch back upon, entitled 10 Little Beauty Queens. Proper annoyingly, I wasn't able to find the full version Jones had written, only an extract from it, which reads as follows. There were 5 little beauty queens going off to war. A tank crushes one to death, and then there were 4. There were 4 little beauty queens sheltering under a tree. A bolt of lightning frizzles one up, and then there were 3. There were 3 little beauty queens boiling up glue. One falls into the pot, and then there were 2. There were 2 little beauty queens going to the loo. One flushes herself down the pan, and then there was 1. There was 1 little beauty queen all on her own. She goes and hangs herself, and then there were none. I think Keats and Tennyson can rest easy, don't you? Now, the plot of his film 10 Little Beauty Queens has never been revealed. To be honest, I don't think he was too into developing the stories there. It was only for his own wank bank, really, wasn't it? But I can imagine that if he went to the trouble of writing a poem such as this, he would try and adhere to it as much as possible whilst making a film of the same name. And it ended on his favourite fantasy, hanging. Police did at one time consider whether this poem was some sort of cryptic reference and meant that Jones had killed others, though he was never to admit to any other crimes and no other unsolved murders or suspicious deaths could be tied to him. But if he had, then you'd have to think he would have filmed them, wouldn't you? All of the films that were found at Jones's home featured models who were subsequently traced and found to be alive and unharmed. So that day in April 1985, did Jones just reach a point where, it having built and built inside him, he was unable to stop fantasy becoming reality, resulting in the death of poor Marion Terry? Or are there possibly films, perhaps still out there to this day, showing several other times when his fantasies became real, captured on screen for his own viewing pleasure? Remember Jones's words in his letter to Christina Attiah. I knew in the end I would have to pay the price for all of the good times. An acceptance of what he'd done, or a hint to other films. What do you guys think then concerning the case of filmmaker Jeffrey Graham Jones? Was Jones's story a plausible one and Marion really did seek out what he classed as the ultimate thrill whilst he was downstairs, tragically hanging herself in the process? Or was his version of events just yet another joining the existing absolute shamble of bollocks stories that people we've met before here on The Enthusiast have given? Did he film Marion instead of saving her? And if so, what happened to the film? And his poem, 10 Little Beauty Queens, could Jones have possibly already killed and filmed other women? Or was he just a sad Martin Scorsese wannabe with a vivid imagination and one who was kinkier than Ray and Dave Davis? Questions, eh? But in all seriousness, this was obviously a very determined, very warped, and very, very dangerous sexual predator. Poor Marion Terry sadly found that out, simply by responding to an innocent sounding advert, a young girl just desperately trying to find some form of employment. And deservedly for his monstrous crime, Jones was taken off the streets for life, away from his camera and away from the beloved black satin that by his own admittance had dominated his life and cost Marion Terry hers. I hope that you guys have found the bonus episode an interesting and informative one. There isn't too much available to research about the case of Jeffrey Jones, but you work with what you can get. And a chilling case indeed, isn't it? It really is. Can you understand why it jumped off the page and screamed Patreon at me? I thank you very much for your continuing support of the show, and once again this month for your understanding and acceptance about the past bonus episodes being released to all to maybe give a little bit of help in times such as these, not just for Patreon subscribers to the show. At least you guys get to hear them first off though, It is business almost as much as usual here on the show, so please join me each week on The Regular Enthusiast. I'm back here of course next month for bonus episode number 28. I thank you guys all very much for joining me here today, and all that remains is for me to say that until we next speak, I've been, I still am, and hopefully still will be Paul, the true crime enthusiast, wishing you guys all the very best. I hope you stay safe, I hope you stay indoors, and just hang in there guys. We shall get through all this. My thoughts out to you all. Take care, and I shall catch you all soon. Goodbye for now.